Never aspire to teach the church at large. Teach your church. Teach a local church. And if the church at large feels like you have something to say to it, it'll come to you.
Well, welcome to the first episode of the Sermon Craft podcast. This is a podcast for communicators who teach regularly and want to become better and more confident in the art and craft of preaching. And so on this podcast, we interview some of today's best communicators about their secrets of turning a blank page into a captivating talk so that you can stop wasting valuable time in sermon prep, find your unique voice, and use the gift that God has given you with excellence and joy. My name's Chase Gardner. I'm a professional speaker with 10 years of preaching under my belt. I've given hundreds of sermons, but I know I have not arrived yet. I want to get better in every facet of preaching just like you. And so our guest this week needs no introduction. He's the lead pastor at the Summit Church, a leader, a teacher, an author. He's the one and only J.D. Greear. I've known JD for about 10 years, and what strikes me about JD is that he is the same person off the stage as he is on the stage. He really does love Jesus and love God's word like he appears to on the stage. He's also used the pulpit to revitalize a church and grow it into one of the most impactful sending centers for the gospel in this country, I think. He's got a lot on his plate, but he still makes his sermon prep central to what he does. And you'll never believe what his answer is when I ask him, hey, what's the most distracting thing that ever happened to you on stage? So get ready for an awesome episode of the Sermon Craft podcast.
Transform your preaching with Sermon Craft. This is a podcast for communicators who teach regularly and want to become better and more confident in the art and craft of preaching. And now your host, Chase Gardner.
When did you feel, and I don't know how you feel about call, but did you feel a call to specifically preaching as a part of your ministry? And how did you experience that if you did experience that?
It's just what I figured in ministry where the most money was, like most guys that get called into ministry. No, I'm just kidding. But worst answer ever. No, so I explained this to a young guy the other day, and I really feel like it's taken about 20 years to come to this, is that, there's a lot of things in the Bible. This part isn't original or new, but there's a lot of things in the Bible that are not contradictions to be resolved, they're tensions to be managed. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think that applies to is how we understand calling, because there are aspects of the Bible, 1 Timothy 3:1 is a good example, that encourage, if you desire the office of church leadership, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And so just an interest in it. I would like to do this. I enjoy this kind of thing. But the other side of that tension is, kind of wrapped up in how Charles Spurgeon, his kind of famous statement, don't go in the ministry unless you absolutely have to. Mm-hmm. And, so on the one side, you got like, let's encourage this. And the other side, it's like, if you can do something else, you should. So I went into college thinking, well, there's a lot of things that I could do and would really enjoy and I was passionate about. And for me, it was law. And so I went in. My pastor told me, hey, you should, if you can do anything else besides ministry, do that. So I go in, and while I did that, two things happened in college. One is I just started to teach the Bible, really to 3 and 4 people at a time. It was like sitting around my dorm room. Mm-hmm. Over the 2 or 3 years that I was in college, it got bigger, like eventually it ended up being, a few hundred people big, not in my dorm room, but just, in the ministry. And I just remember thinking, I love this. I love this. I love this. I want to do this. I love law, but not like I love this over here. Simultaneous to that was studying through the book of Romans and realizing the fate of the people in the world that had never heard the gospel. Mm-hmm. And I remember this, these all things coming together and just saying, God, if you will allow me to, I want to preach the gospel mainly to people who've never heard it. Yeah. And I felt like the Lord was like, Isaiah 6 was like, you may go. And he gave me permission. And so it kind of brought those two sides of the tension together. Like I would never dare do this without feeling like God was in it. But I also feel like there's an initiative thing. And so all that to say is that all came together. I served as a missionary for a couple of years in an unreached people group. Really felt like God showed me that the call that I have to preach is a sub calling to the call to reach unreached people groups. And so a lot of the preaching that I do, yes, it's here in America in what is a relatively church place, but there's a lot of great commission and God has put us here so that you could go and be a blessing to the nations. So anyway, that's sort of a long rambling way of saying, that's how all that went down.
I actually had that as a question because you did spend some time overseas with an unreached people group. And that, I think, just listening and sitting under your preaching, I can see the shaping influence. But how would you describe that? Was it a huge shaping influence on your preaching when you first started? Has it continued? How did your time overseas affect the way that you viewed the call of preaching or the task?
Yeah, but Chase, there's a number of ways to answer that question. I mean, the first thing I think of is Leslie Newbegin's, famous kind of thing where he talked about how when he was in India, as a Western person living in India, he realized that what was happening in the Western world was going to require the same missionary skills that the cross-cultural missionary was using. And so just the shaping influence of having to preach and teach in a different culture, I think shaped how I think as a preacher today. There's a second layer of that, and that is, realizing that, yes, I mean, there are lots of lost people in the Raleigh-Durham area where I pastor, but there is quite literally a church just about on every corner. Mm-hmm. And God's hand is always on a people for the sake of, the people that have never heard. And when those people aren't obeying, then he takes his hand and goes elsewhere. I think you can almost see the migration of the missionary and the hand of God right now going to, South America and places in Africa and Korea that are really taking this seriously. And so, yeah, I mean, it's Christopher C.J.H. Wright wrote that book a number of years ago, The Mission of God. Mm-hmm. And it's not a perfect book, but in there, one of the things he points out is that every single passage in the Bible is written in pursuit of God's great commission. And that it's not that missions exist in a few sections of the Bible. He says literally, God doesn't have a mission for his church. He forms a church for his mission. And it means any passage you preach that you're not connecting to the larger thing of what God is doing in the world of seeing the gospel go to all the different nations and people groups, you've preached it wrongly. And so I think at every possible level, it's affected the way I preach. The last thing I'll say there, we may get into this more as we preach, as we talk here about preaching, but this is not an official classification, but there are some pastors who preach like entertainers. They're really high quotient in terms of capturing your attention. There's some that really they're really awesome, faithful exegetes. My favorite preachers are the ones that preach like leaders. That preaching is a function of their leadership.
Right.
And they're not preaching about leadership. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying that they're disciple makers. And so in their preaching, you're hearing them move people into, greater discipleship and in the Great Commission. And so I kind of approach this like of all the things, this could be taken out of context. I don't want to preach like an exegete.
Right.
I want to preach like a leader who is leading people to discipleship and mission and obedience based on what the scriptures say.
Did you sit under a pastor like that growing up, or did you have a shaping influence that preached as a part of that leadership?
Man, that's a revealing question. Yes, but it wasn't the main pastors that I grew up under. My very first pastor was like that, but I was so young. I basically living on what my parents tell me about his memory, Dr. E.C. Sheehan. Yeah. My other pastors that I had were very faithful men of God, but there was a youth pastor that I had that was that way. He, everything connected to him. So people coming to know Christ and mobilizing out there. It was an independent Baptist background.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of things that I don't do exactly like the independent Baptist. I mean, when I graduated high school, the question was, you want to go to Bob Jones or Pensacola? Those are your two choices. But you know what? They taught me to highly value the Bible. Mm-hmm. They taught me to be passionate about Jesus, and they taught me to win people to Christ. I'll take those three things any day of the week. Yeah. Those are a big win in my book, and that gives me a lot of grace for the rest of the, kind of stuff that came along with it.
Yeah. Do you remember the first sermon you ever gave?
Yes,
I know you led Bible studies, but like on a stage with a microphone, maybe even a camera. You remember that?
Yeah, well, no camera, but it was other than my mom taking pictures in the back with a disposable, Kodak. But it was at my home church. They had a youth night on Sunday night, and they're going to get a youth to preach. And I ripped off an old Vance Havner sermon.
Yeah.
Vance, and when I say ripped off, like I read it and tried to make it my own, but I look back now, it was terribly eisegetical. Yeah. What I did with the passage had nothing to do, but it was that classic. It's sort of like a Pentecostal / independent Baptist way of taking some Old Testament thing and reading all this meaning into it.
Yeah.
But man, as bad as that sermon was, I loved it. I mean, that was like, I got a taste of it. And I don't think it was just being in front of people and the attention. I think it was just, I love seeing people. I love seeing their lives change. That moment where you just feel like, man, people are getting this and they're knowing God better.
That's awesome. How long did it take for you to find your unique voice? Because I think all of us kind of idolize the pastors that, I mean, growing up, I had the first iPod and I had Matt Chandler and John Piper, and I sounded like Matt Chandler and John Piper, and it took me a long time to figure out you're not anything like them, like in real life. So how long did it take you to find your unique voice?
Yeah, I remember reading a book on that. It was at least 10 years in the ministry by a guy named Dave Stone, the old pastor of Southeast Christian Church. And I can't even find that book anymore, but he had in there and he classified different kind of preachers, and it like suddenly made sense to me because so my two big influences, my first 4 or 5 years that were contemporary that I wanted to be like, actually was three. One was Clayton King.
Yeah.
And he was like an evangelist. One was, but the big ones were Rob Bell. He was doing all these Numa videos, and just like, and this is before he kind of went, Oprah.
Oh, yeah.
But he was just,
I think I still have the Numa DVDs in the blue case, like somewhere.
They were amazing.
Because if you're a youth pastor in like the early 2000s, you had them.
That's what you do. Yeah. So, man, and so, but it's reflective and kind of, just the Rob Bell and then Mark Driscoll at the same time. So there's a reason you can't find sermons pre-2008 on our website because it is whiplash.
Yeah.
I mean, it is like, because I go right from Rob Bell, kind of that reflective, I go right into a Driscoll-esque kind of like yelling at everybody with their names. Yeah. It sounds so confused. It was probably, I think I really didn't get comfortable till, I want to say 2013 or 14 with this is kind of who I am. And even since then, it took a while. Keller's got that famous statement. He's like, you listen to one person, you're a clone. Listen to two, you sound confused. 10 or more, and given, probably 10 years or more, you start to find your own voice. And that's certainly how it was for me. I look back now and I realize, okay, there's a little bit of Keller in there, that cultural apologist and kind of Christ-centered approach to a text. There's a little bit of independent Baptist still in me. Yeah. I mean, I've had people describe me before as the open the Bible and yell at people guy. So that's but there's also a little bit of, dare I say, Andy Stanley, that kind of like, man, how do you take the first 10 minutes of your message and make everybody want to listen? I'd like to think that there's some influence, in that too. Tony Evans is another big influence. I love him. He's been a big impact on me. So
that's awesome. So what is your process? This is where we'll spend the most time. I guess your process has probably changed. So what was sermon writing process like for you when you first kind of took over, the church that you serve at now, the Summit Church, and what does it look like now? I'm familiar with kind of the middle part, but now that you're so busy and you have so much impact in so many places, what did it look like at the beginning, and what does it look like now?
Yeah, it really hadn't changed, even with all the size of the church or the additional staff. What's changed is the quality with which it happens, these things. And then the second thing would be really how much of it I can do. I'm able, through the use of staff, to have a lot more resources at my disposal. I've always been 70 to 80% of my week, at least, should be reserved for that, whether I use it all or not. I've always done the morning times. That's when my brain is the most alive and making the best creative connections. So from the very beginning, when it was essentially just me and I took over a church. I didn't plant, so we always had a very small staff. But when it was a really small staff, I still just would not meet with people in the mornings. And that kind of it actually was a little bit unpopular in the church because there's a crisis, of course, yes, but just said, I'm going to take every morning because I knew that the value that I would add, whether you're thinking spiritual value or even just professionally, took place in that hour on Sunday morning. And, I was willing to let some other things slide if it meant that I could devote that time. I always tell our guys at Summit that we're trained to preach, I'm like, there's some guys that don't need to hear that because they would spend 38 of their 40 hours a week there. And you need to get out and talk to people. But for a lot of us, because we do want to take care of people and because we're kind of people pleasers, you just end up letting other people eat away your week. And I was like, no, I'm gonna block that off. And so it's been the same. The process for me, I've always been a week of guy.
Well, how do you plan out the sermon series? How far in advance do you plan those out?
We're about 6 to 9 months.
Okay.
And about once every 3 to 6 months, we get together and there's a few of us teaching pastors. I'm definitely take the lead role in that. I've done it in consultation with our elders. We usually have our counseling pastor and some female representatives there. We try to have everybody in the room. We just say, where do we need to go in the course of the year? And we throw out some stuff and we decide on things. That's a very loose. I mean, we have the books of the Bible. We're about 2 months ahead when it comes to the specific passage.
Okay.
And that's because there's so many other things that take place with it, the small groups team and the programming team. And I know I frustrate them sometimes because sometimes I'll get into a passage and feel like this needs to be 2 messages, not one.
Yeah.
And they very graciously reserve the right for me to do that. I try to, keep things, realizing there's a lot more, that rides on it. But, so I'll take that week. I start for the most part on that Monday, other than just the general idea, like Ephesians 2 is about blank, it's about unity in the church through the gospel. We know that, but I won't have a lot more than that. And the first thing I do, and again, I used to do all this myself, is when I open it up now on Monday morning, my research assistant has populated a folder that's got everything from, let's say 3 or 4 of my go-to preachers, and we're trying to rotate who those are in there, but, depending on passage, 3 or 4 of the go-to preachers at least will be in there. There's some initial commentary work, but I say very initial. I'm going to say something in a minute that will disappoint some of the preaching purists, but I stand by it. Let me come back to it. Mm-hmm. But a little bit of commentary work. Most of my commentary work is going to come later in the week, and then just sort of he's kind of written a map for me of like, here's all the things. He's already met with a group of people in our church. I used to do this myself too, but he's met with them, counseling pastor, women leaders in our church, diversity, minority, and just said, hey, here's all the concerns we have coming into this passage. Here's some big takeaways. I'll spend my first 3 or 4 hours on Monday morning just going through all that stuff. I will have spent a decent amount of time in the text the week before, just kind of pondering it. And by the time I get done with Monday, I've got a general trajectory of where it's going. Commentary work, the reason I say it comes later is because, I've preached and I've taught enough, and that I can usually tell the majority of places that there is something in the passage that needs to be dug down in.
Right.
I used to, when I first started, I was trying to be so pure, Chase. I would have like Greek New Testament was my first thing, reading and making sure it's in the and then I'd read all the commentaries on it. And man, I'd spend 10 to 15 hours.
Yeah. And
it just wasn't efficient time. And so now I'm like, okay, there's something here in this verse that we need to go deeper on. Sometimes, that's what listening to these other preachers and teachers and my own reading will and just a study Bible will be like, okay, there's something else here I need to do some work on.
Yeah.
And so that usually happens on Tuesday or Wednesday if I'm still pressing in on that. Monday, then after I get that initial thing, it goes back out to this team and they look over it and they tell me whether they like the direction, probably.
Is it just a loose outline? Just a
loose outline, but it's got a little meat to it, enough that you can tell where it's going.
Yeah.
And so like, for example, our counseling pastor might look at it and say, I can see on this, you're trying to really lean on this, but I just know there's a lot of people in our church going to hear it this other way.
Yeah.
They're going to hear it, and it's going to create a sense of shame the way that you're talking about this. So I want to encourage you to take this approach with it, and so and then Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm doing, that's just hardcore writing. There's a little bit of back and forth between me and my research assistant, like I said, commentary work. Thursday is just where I'm polishing and cutting. Yes. That's all that happens on Thursday. I've always heard the difference in a good sermon and a great sermon is not what you put in, it's what you cut out.
Yep.
So Thursday is that. I manuscript word for word.
Yep.
And I would encourage generally everybody to do that. I would encourage very few people to take the manuscript into the pulpit itself because most people, they don't write the way they speak.
Yeah, they write for the eye instead of the ear.
Correct. And they don't interact with their notes well. For whatever reason and how God has designed me, I do write the way I speak, and I do interact with notes or wherever I've got them. I interact fairly well. So I actually carry my full manuscript into the pulpit.
Yep. And you use a physical copy. You don't use digital, right?
Correct. Well, a physical copy, and I actually put it up on now in our auditorium.
Okay.
It's on the, I have some different places that are, teleprompter usually means it's right here.
Yeah.
But think screens that are back there that other people in the audience can't see unless they turn around and look. So I have it there too. So I'm looking here, I'm looking there, and I'm looking at people. And it's a system that works for me that allows me the greatest access of nodes plus people.
That's cool.
So, and then we review it after Thursday night. There's always because some things you just don't know until you get it out. And I'm like, that didn't work. I love the book. Who was it? Guy wrote the metaphor of getting down the mountain, preaching that moves people.
Yeah. He's going to be on, actually, I think. Yancey?
Say again?
Yeah, Yancey's going to be on the podcast.
Oh, great. Well, that's the most important preaching book nobody's ever heard of.
Yeah.
Because he just says at the beginning, I'm going to take for granted that you already understand the theology and the hermeneutics and the Brian Chappell, D. Martin Lloyd Jones stuff on preaching. I'm going to take for granted you know that. If you don't, go back and read that, he said. But then a lot of people just get stuck in being able to move a sermon along. I'm getting better at that, but it's that Thursday night that I can usually tell, like, man, we just got stuck in point 2.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I told 4 illustrations on one point. All I needed to do was make the point and move. But, Thursday and then Sunday is ready.
So Thursday night, is that an actual service? And do you record it in case there's a problem with the live stream? Is that why you do the recording?
Yeah, we record it for the live stream. We also do it because 1 or 2 of our campuses start early enough, or earlier than the broadcast campus does. So they need something they can show on Sunday morning.
And so you don't do the sermon before that Thursday first run. So you get on the stage, it's recorded, then you get back with a group of people and kind of discuss it, or is that just a you individual thing?
That's me. We're not physically together, but we're on email. We're going back and forth. We use a Google Doc, so there's commenting right in there.
And then do you run, if you edit it a lot, do you run it again, or no? You just kind of put it in your outline, change the outline, and just hit the ground running on Sunday.
Morning. So there are people at our church that hear what I consider to be a slightly deficient sermon.
Yeah.
Because they'll hear it on Thursday or the one of the early Sunday morning ones. After 9:00, it's all live streamed.
Yeah.
But people usually say that they can't tell as much of a difference as I can. Yeah. I feel like it's a night and day difference, but they're like, it sounded the same.
Yeah. That's awesome. So what advice, obviously you still devote probably 70-80% of your week to sermon prep, even now?
Yeah, that's fair. 60 to 70.
That's awesome. Why would you encourage pastors to do that? Like, from a church planter, I mean, early on, it's almost like, because you got to raise funds, you have to do the databases yourself, all that sort of stuff. But I've heard from Andrew Hopper, I've heard from other pastors as well, that it's really important to prioritize preaching. And you still do it even today. How long have you been in ministry? How long have you been at the Summit?
I've been at Summit since 2002. So that's 22 years now?
Yeah. What are some things that's happened at Summit that wouldn't have happened because of your preaching?
Well, so again, I want to answer on 2 levels. On a spiritual level, preaching drives the church.
Yeah.
It is the word of God. I mean, I believe the word of God gives life. And so I want to devote time to proclaiming that word, believing that it just, it's like Luther said, I preached the Bible and sat back and, his words, he said, I sat back and drank beer and the word did all the work. And so I believe that still happens in the church. And so, I think devoting yourself to give faithful, timely, vision sensitive, application rich, that stuff just takes time, and you got to work at it. It's 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. Mm-hmm. On the professional side, and you got to be careful with this because we're brothers, we're not professionals, as John Piper said. On the professional side, preaching grows the church. I mean, you ask why people come to a church. It's the preaching, the worship. Sometimes it's the kids and the facility, but it's preaching is a huge part of that. It's not why they stay at the church. They stay because of connections and friendships, but they come because of that. And so just professionally, I'm like, I could be a mid-range counselor. I could be a below average administrator. These things are going to bless the church if I'm mid-range at all those, but I know that I'd be able eventually to hire people who were skilled in those things. So even for a church planner, yes, I get it. You got a lot of stuff to do. I think it's fully okay for you to lean even more heavily on some of your preaching heroes. You acknowledge it, but you can lean a little bit more heavily as you're devoting some leadership there. But But this is what's going to grow and sustain your church, and it's going to feed you personally. So of all the things to cut, I would just say don't cut that. They need to realize that pastoring is people.
Yeah.
And so you're the majority of us, I think, probably need to hear preserve time for preparation. But there's a handful of people need to hear like, hey, you got to be with people because your sermon sounds like whoever you talk to that week.
Yep.
And that's why you preach your worst sermons in seminary, because you're talking essentially to a bunch of seminary students from the pulpit. Nobody wants to hear that. But if you're actually in people's lives, then it becomes so much richer and more personal because you're leading people and you're not just exegeting a text.
How do you think through, because now, I mean, I listened to you on the radio the other day. Is that Molly that does the intro?
It is.
It is, yeah. Molly and us, we went to the same summer camp growing up, which is crazy.
I remember that. Yeah.
So now, I mean, you have such a huge audience, and then you added radio on a few years ago. So when you get up and you preach the message, or you're writing it that Tuesday and Wednesday, do you have in your mind a global audience, or are you specifically trying to preach and teach the Summit Church at this moment in time in this geographical location?
I'd be dishonest if I didn't say I'm thinking occasionally about that global audience.
Yeah.
But I've tried really hard not to let it shape.
Right.
Because the guys that I've heard in the past that you could almost hear it, the transition when they went from being a pastor of a local church to being a pastor who had a live audience in one city and he was preaching to the world. And I felt like, man, it took the quality of their preaching down. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther said in a series of lectures he gave to his young, ministry students, seminary students, it became, I think it was the bond, freedom of the Christian. I think it was that word. It's the intro. And he made this statement I've never forgotten. He said, never aspire to teach the church at large. Teach your church. Teach a local church. And if the church at large feels like you have something to say to it, it'll come to you. And so whether it's books I'm writing or podcast or radio stuff, I'm like, this is first and foremost for the Summit Church. If it can be adapted to use in one of those other forms, that's fine. But I would feel almost, I don't want to use too strong of a word, but I would feel almost like I'm prostituting myself if I turned that pulpit into a global thing and said, this is first and foremost for these people that God has called me to lead.
No, that's so good. On that note, are there today, I think I've preached not nearly as much as you, but I had different goals and different desires for my sermons at an early age than I do now. So are there some priorities that you've just learned over the past 10, 15 years that when you get up in the pulpit, these 2 or 3 things, I can sleep well tonight because I hit those 2 or 3 benchmarks? Are there 2 or 3 things that you go for in every sermon?
Well, you tease me by saying that you've checked. Tell me what yours are real quick.
I don't know. No one asked me that question yet, so probably think about it tonight. No, I think for me it would be faithful to the text, but also I want to make a real connection with the person's heart. So I actually want to connect with them. That means setting the Bible aside and just having a conversation around the text for a while before they let their guard down, so I can apply that text. But it's that connection I think I'm after most of the time.
Yeah. D. Martin Lloyd-Jones has this famous conversation where he was talking to preachers in the 1950s, and he said, there was a controversy in the 1950s about whether sermons, because you were starting to have the hints of the megachurch,
right? And
should sermons be more doctrinally rich or should they be more application heavy? And a lot of the church growth guys were saying, look, you got to apply. That's where the growth is. And D. Martin Lloyd-Jones weighed in and he said, well, respectfully, I would say neither of those is the goal of a true sermon. He said, the goal of a motivational speech is that you leave with a page full of action steps. The goal of a lecture is that you leave with a page full of notes.
Yeah.
He said the goal of a true biblical message is that you leave worshiping. And he said that there should come a time in every sermon where the pen goes down, whether you're writing down action steps or facts about, whatever, where the pen goes down and the eyes go up and you stop saying, oh my God, look at all these things that I've got to do for you. And you start saying, oh my God, look at what you've done for me.
Yeah.
And so my benchmark really, and I hope this doesn't sound too hyper spiritual, but are people loving Jesus more? And are they really being moved to worship? Are they talking about what a creative sermon that was? Are they talking about even the things they got to do? Or are they, am I going to leave the Summit Church, whenever that is? Am I going to leave that body of people more in love with Jesus because they realize how much God is in love with them? Is he really glorified in the preaching? That's probably the one that I think about the most. The other, and I would say a much secondary thing is have I given something to the people that are in the room in a way that would really help them grow, whether they're the mom that's struggling because she's trying to work two jobs, take care of her single mom, take care of her kids. Is it we have a large prison audience that listens to us, and I think about them, like what kind of hope is there in there for them? I think about all the teenagers in our church. I think about some just pure unbelieving or de-churched, deconstructing people. And I'm like, am I addressing their questions? Or am I just talking to a little echo chamber of Christians who like sermons?
Yeah.
I want to be an evangelist. I want to be a leader and a disciple maker. I hinted at this a moment ago, but ultimately preaching is part of the disciple making command in the Great Commission. It's been pointed out the Great Commission only has one verb in it. The verb is make disciples. All the other things in the Great Commission that look to us in English like verbs or in Greek, they're participles. Going, baptizing, teaching them to observe all things. Those are all participles. And what that means in Greek is that they come out of the verb. The center verb is make disciples, which means my job is not teaching them to observe all things. My job is making disciples, and I'm using teaching all things as a part of the disciple making process. So that's my question is, have I made disciples better through the teaching of all things and the Greek things I pointed out and all the history? Have I made disciples better? That's my benchmark.
So good. What would you say, what's 2 or 3 things you would encourage for the young pastor? Maybe one that's just stepping into the pulpit weekly, or maybe one that, gets a shot to teach on the big stage, however big that is, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. What would you encourage them to do? Maybe some habits, maybe some books to read, maybe some priorities or perspective?
Yeah, one would be give it time.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, I stepped in and I wanted to, Malcolm Gladwell ends up being right. The 10,000 hours is what it takes to get good at something. And there's really no shortcut to that. I don't care how many books you read, how much you listen to, take every chance, especially if you're listening to this right now and you're not really even in a pulpit yet. I mean, I used to preach at rest homes and FCAs with 2 people. And I mean, it was just like, but I was getting reps and I was learning.
Yeah.
So take every chance. If you're called as a preacher, I'd never heard a sermon probably for 7 or 8 years after I just started to discern the call that I didn't re-preach in my head and figure out how I would have done that.
Yeah.
It might be the greatest preacher in the world, but I'm like, well, I would have done it this way. And that's healthy. It's a good thing. Yeah. So one is give it time. 2 is, really, really meditate and ask God, like, all right, am I doing this, A, to glorify God and B, make disciples? Or is there some other thing in my heart that I really enjoy? Because if your preaching ever gets beyond those 2 things, then I feel like it's gotten off course and become idolatrous. It's to make people love God and to make disciples. Probably the third thing I would really encourage them to is I feel like most of us practically, we try to do too much in sermons.
Yeah.
I've really been attracted. I'm not a one-point preacher, where but I would say that I'm more and more, things are getting simpler.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, there's one point that I'm going to try to, I may say it 3 or 4 different ways, or this point may have different components, but I want people to be able to summarize the entire message in kind of one thing, realizing that life change. John Piper said it. Sermons don't change people. Books don't change people. Sentences change people.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be some kind of sentence in there that captures the whole thing, that people say, my life is different now because of that one sentence. And so I think when I go back and listen to earlier sermons, sometimes even 5 years ago, it's like a Wikipedia entry. Like I'm trying to literally put everything in there about this subject. I'm like, you know what? These people have room for one thought.
Yeah.
on kind of this subject. I'm not going to try to do the Wikipedia article. I'm just going to try to give them this one thing and realize that over a lifetime, they'll assemble the rest.
Yeah. No, that's good. Well, thanks for that. We have something called the quick fire round. And so I want to just ask you just a handful of questions, 5 or 6, just so that the younger preachers, those that are just starting out, will realize I am not alone, the stuff that I'm experiencing. But have you ever just bombed during a sermon? Like absolutely
Oh, my
bombed?
goodness. I mean, I used to walk off stage, especially those first ones, and be like, I got to do something else in my life. That was absolutely terrible.
Do you remember a specific one or no? There's just too many to remember.
I mean, really is. Yeah. I mean, just sometimes what's frustrating is when one of the reasons I manuscript is because I get so frustrated. Like one sermon would kill.
Yeah.
And then the next, the same message. And I'm like, and I'd say it and it wouldn't land. So I'd say it again and I'd try it, and I'd circle that runway like 10 times. And the sermon started to be like 55 minutes, an hour, trying to create what happened in the first service.
Yeah. So it happens to all of us. I think the last time I did it was in 2014 up in Asheville at a college. And I tried to shrink a 40-minute message to a 14-minute message. And I got off the stage and my wife was like, what was that? And I was like, I have no idea. So I
remember one time, I hope this doesn't come out and discourage somebody in the wrong way, but I just really felt the Lord, like I had my sermon, and it was ready, and I felt like the Lord was saying, I want you to do something different.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk about it. And I was like, well, so I'm just going to get up there. So I got up there and I tried to pull a Francis Chan,
No, yeah.
where you just start talking on a word and 45 minutes later, nobody could tell you what you said, but it was awesome, know? So I got up there and I was like, I just want to talk about forgiveness. And man, I puttered around for 12 or 13 minutes and I was like, this is awful. Like I just was kind of roused, like, and something else I've been thinking about. And how about this? And this ever happened to you? And it was terrible. And my only hope is maybe in all the awfulness, there was one person out there that needed to hear one little shard of something about forgiveness. And God said, we're going to do that today. Who knows?
What is the most distracting thing to happen in the audience as you were preaching?
Well, 2 or 3 weeks ago, a woman, passed out on the front row. And the distracting part though was, I mean, I love our EMS workers and our fire, but sometimes there's a handful of people that kind of live for that moment.
Yeah.
And so they're like down front. I mean, this is like their moment to shine. They're giving orders. I'm trying to preach because, 2/3 of the people listening to me are listening to the camera right there.
Right.
So they can't even see anything. And most of the people in the audience can't see it. But now I got people coming in and they're, yelling stuff at each other across. And I'm like, guys, because I could see it wasn't life threatening.
Right.
I was like, just, kind of move her out. But we had turned into a thing like down front. So that was a pretty distracting thing. One time I had a cold or getting over a cold and I told a joke and I made myself laugh.
Yeah.
And so when I made myself laugh, I kind of laughed and blew this like snot sickle out on my shirt. Yeah. And I saw it and I thought, I bet you I can get it before anybody sees it. So I took my hand and I went like that and it was a gray shirt, light gray. So it smeared it. And so now it's this big, it looked like I'd been shot. And so I just had to stop and tell everybody, I'm like, y'all, I just blew snot out of my nose and I just smeared it. And I don't know, there's no way to recover from this. So could we all just take a moment, think about how awful this is, and then I'm going to keep going.
That's hilarious. I think that one takes the cake. You're a brave man to wear a gray shirt on stage, too.
So one other quick story. My son, we did this Christmas at the Durham Portman Art Center.
Yeah.
A couple weeks ago. And I had my son quote Luke 2 before I got up to preach. He's 14. Actually, he was 13 at the time. And it was, he did a great job. So before the first service, he texts me from his little watch. And he's like, because he's on the opposite side of the stage. He's like, Dad, I need you here now. All caps now. I go over to where he is. He's back in our little green room and he's got this panicked look because he was like, Dad, I had to use the bathroom and I missed. And so he had on a pair of khaki pants.
Yeah.
And he's about to get up in front of like 3,000 people,
yeah.
His like big debut. And I was like, son, I want you to know that this happens to me enough that I always have a hairdryer in the green room supplied. Because when you run that water fountain and it splashes up all over you, I'm saying, so whether it's pee or whether it's water.
The water bottle condensation. Yeah.
Yes, and it drips in the wrong place.
Yeah.
So I just use the hairdryer and just realized that Dad's done this at least 50 times while he was preaching. And so he was like, okay. So and then by the time you got up, you couldn't see it.
I recorded Christmas Eve. I recorded it 2 years ago, got off stage, felt great, and the guy said, hey, your fly was down the whole time. And I was like, what? But the camera shot was chest up, so I'm like, I'm good. It's fine.
You're perfect.
Only you noticed it, yeah. On a more serious note, have you ever experienced anxiety or depression during ministry? Any mental health issues?
I feel like I'm supposed to say yes.
No.
But I'm in how God wires different people. I have maybe a point I can make with this. That's just not something I've yet to experience.
Right.
But I want to say I know enough people whose walk with God is better than mine, whose skill in ministry exceeds mine, that have been through those seasons. Mm-hmm. Enough that, we all want to imitate each other, and whether it's somebody's how they work or how they preach or how they deal with emotional things, God gave you a particular vessel of your body, and you've got to learn it. Mm-hmm. And I've had to do that in some areas of my life, a lot of areas where I'm just like, God did not make me that person. Mm-hmm. And I've had gift envy. I've had, I've coveted. So I want to give that answer just very cautiously. Some of it is just the energy and the mindset. There's some of the relationships God's given me. I've never had that. And I feel like I would be more helpful if I could say, oh yes, me and Louis Giglio, we both went through a time in 2022 where we wanted to quit or whatever it was. And I mean, because I think that's real. It just, anyway.
Has there been a time where it's been hard to preach? Maybe not because of depression or anxiety, but because of family stuff or interpersonal relationships, and you have to compartmentalize so much to get up there? Because, I mean, the truth is lots of stuff can happen Monday through Saturday, but there are 3 30-minute periods where you have to get up there and just preach.
Yeah, there have been a couple times that, like I had to say to, because Veronica and I, my wife and I, were just, according to 1 Peter, my prayers are being hindered because she and I are not in fellowship with each other. And to say, because then you start to feel like a hypocrite. And I have this kind of moment of like, all right, but I'm like, okay, Lord, I am very committed to working through this with her and getting to the other side. I don't know what the solution is, but my yes is on the table. A couple times there have been things, when you start to worry about your kids and you're like, if my own kids don't follow this, have I lost my motivation to preach altogether? Like, I almost felt angry, because I have teenagers, and I don't care who they are as a teenager. They're going to have weeks and months where you're like, what is happening in you right now? And every parent fears the loss of their kids. So I'm not trying to imply anything special about my kids, or none of them right now are in a state where, by the grace of God, they've rejected these things. But you just have moments where you're and you feel like, I almost felt like God at some of these seasons, like, you let me down. Like, you didn't keep up your side of the bargain. I was supposed to do this and you were supposed to do that. And it makes you really kind of have to go back to the gospel to say, all right, what do I deserve? And, am I in a place where I'm going to be more righteous and more caring and more compassionate than God is? And the answer, of course, is no. Mm-hmm. And I've got to be willing to trust him with some of those things. Martin Luther said one of the greatest things about faith. He said, faith sometimes is just not thinking about it. Mm. Because if you're trying to think about it, you're going to wrestle with the devil and lose. So you just say, I know God's got this. I know he's good. I know he's got a solution. I can't enter that right now. And when I step into this pulpit, I'm going to have to shut that off. And that is a statement of faith, because I know that eventually, as I'm getting through this, God's going to have a solution and I can trust him with it.
That's good. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us, JD.
Yeah, I feel like I did the classic preacher thing with the rapid fire, and each of those answers was about 2 minutes each.
Sorry.
Instead of 2 sentences.
Yeah, dude, appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Sermon Craft with Chase Gardner. Available to download wherever you get your podcasts.